When we think of Rome, we often picture its monumental achievements, but the stories of its prisoners of war are usually overlooked. Behind the scenes of Rome's rise were countless warriors whose battles didn't end when they were captured. They faced a grim new world as prisoners, whether fighting for their lives as gladiators or as slaves. Their experiences offer a different perspective on Rome, far from the grand narratives of victory and power. Welcome back to Uncharted History. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the harsh realities for these prisoners and uncover what life was really like for captives in ancient Rome. On the battlefield, defeat often led to a harsh reality for soldiers. They were taken as prisoners and forced into slavery. These captured soldiers weren't just locked up, they were put to use. Many went from being honored warriors to laborers and entertainers against their will. They were treated as war trophies, their ranks and rights taken away, bought and sold like any other goods. Take the gladiatorial games, for instance. Here, some of the prisoners were trained to fight to the death for public amusement. These gladiator schools turned fighters into performers. Previously, these men had fought for their countries. Now they fought for their lives and the approval of the audience. Being a gladiator was dangerous, but it came with the chance of fame for the few who could win over the crowd and defeat their foes. However, not all prisoners ended up in the arena. Some, because of their skills or knowledge, took on new roles within Roman society. They might become teachers, artisans, or consultants. Some were even able to gain a certain level of respect and freedom, becoming part of the very culture that had once conquered them. The destinies of these prisoners were diverse. Some were tragic, but others managed to find fortune and status in their new lives. Their experiences were a complicated mix of loss and new beginnings, sharply contrasting with their past lives as soldiers. Living conditions for captives awaiting trial were harsh. The holding cells were overcrowded, uncomfortable, and poorly lit, with the air thick with the stench of sweat, sewage, and the unmistakable hint of fear. Light was a luxury, as was space in these quarters. These spaces weren't designed for people to stay in for long periods, but often that's exactly what happened. The so-called meals, barely enough to sustain life, consisted of moldy bread that crumbled to the touch and a scant few drops of murky water that barely quenched an incessant thirst. There was no concern for comfort or health, only the essentials to make sure prisoners could survive until their trial. Comparing these conditions to those in prisoners of war camps, one can see clear differences. Prisoner of war camps, aka POW camps, though far from pleasant, sometimes had a basic level of organization and resource allocation. Roman detention facilities didn't pretend to offer any sense of rights or dignity to those inside. They were places where any sense of respect or hope could be quickly lost, well before a final judgment was made. Prisoners in ancient Rome were put to work, their labor a key part of the empire's strength. They worked in fields and on construction sites, replacing weapons with farming tools and building materials. The agricultural sector, crucial to Rome, relied significantly on this compulsory labor, and large estates often operated thanks to the efforts of these prisoners. Rome also made use of these specific skills among its captives. Expert blacksmiths, carpenters, and stonemasons were assigned to projects that expanded the empire's infrastructure. Roads were extended, structures were built taller, and machinery grew more sophisticated because of the skilled work of these prisoners. This was not kindness, but a calculated use of resources. The forced labor of prisoners was fundamental to Rome's economic success. They helped to create the infrastructure and monuments that displayed Rome's grandeur and contributed to its wealth. Prisoners of war in ancient Rome faced a grim reality that was often dictated by their rank and the desires of their captors. Unlike Roman citizens, their fates were uncertain and usually bleak. For high-status captives like Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who valiantly stood against Julius Caesar, the end was notably infamous. He was held for years before his public execution, a spectacle aimed at cementing Roman power and humiliating a once formidable adversary. The treatment of such prestigious prisoners was a complex affair, as their captivity and execution were symbolic gestures. While Vercingetorix was granted a prolonged period before facing his grim fate, likely due to his status, others weren't so fortunate. High-profile prisoners could be paraded in victories, spectacles where they were displayed before the mocking crowds, only to be executed or enslaved afterward. For the average prisoner of war, however, the situation was dire from the beginning. Many were thrust into the brutal world of gladiatorial games, where they fought not for honor or glory, but simply for survival. These were not citizens who had committed crimes, but soldiers who'd fought against Rome, and were now part of the gruesome entertainment that fed the Roman appetite for violence. They were symbols of Rome's conquests, flesh and blood trophies of the empire's might. Others might end up laboring in the mines or rowing in the galleys, where the harsh conditions and grueling labor ensured a life of suffering. The sentence for these individuals was not a swift execution, but a prolonged demise, a slow and torturous death in the service of the empire. The fate of Hannibal, another famous prisoner, although he was never paraded in Rome like Vercingetorix, also illustrates the Roman approach to such distinguished enemies. While he evaded capture for years, his eventual suicide, preferring death over humiliation, underscores the dread that the prospect of Roman captivity instilled in those who opposed them. Prisoners of lesser ranks were often subjected to public executions that served dual purposes. They were a warning to anyone who would defy Roman might and a form of grim entertainment for the masses. These were not just simple acts of justice, but performances that reinforced the state's authority and the peril of opposing it. The arenas, synonymous with gladiatorial valor, also became stages for the final act of many prisoners of war. There was no glory here for the captives, only an end that served as a brutal lesson to those who watched. The message was clear: Rome's enemies would be crushed, and their downfall would be as public as possible, ensuring that the lesson would not be forgotten. While Roman citizens might have faced public punishments and executions, prisoners of war often endured a fate that was arguably harsher. They were stripped of their combatant status and turned into tools for state propaganda and public morale, often meeting their end in a foreign land before the eyes of an empire that took delight in their defeat. The relentless nature of Roman justice spared no one, especially not those who had the misfortune of becoming prisoners of war. Being a prisoner of war in ancient Rome wasn't just a physical ordeal, it took a heavy mental toll as well. Captives lost more than their freedom. They were stripped of their identities, becoming anonymous and forgotten within Roman walls. This mental struggle aimed to break down prisoners, turning individuals into mere shadows of their former selves. This process was like a social death. The captives were alive, but in the eyes of their captors, and sometimes in their own view, they ceased to exist as persons. They were like ghosts, trapped between their past selves and the roles they were forced into. This kind of psychological struggle could leave scars just as damaging as physical abuse. Some held on to the hope of being ransomed or exchanged, a hope that could be the source of strength or a cause of deeper despair when it didn't come true. The fight between maintaining hope and giving in to hopelessness was a defining part of the prisoner's psychological experience. This aspect of their suffering was as significant as any physical hardship they endured. Freedom for a prisoner of war in Rome was a hard-won victory, and it didn't guarantee an easy life afterward. Being freed, or manumission, was uncommon and usually required either a powerful sponsor or a hefty sum of money. For soldiers who regained their freedom, reintegrating into society was a challenge. They often faced stigma, seen as somehow different because of their experiences. They had to work hard to earn their place back in the community, dealing with distrust and skepticism. Yet, these former captives contributed significantly to Roman society. They brought back unique skills and perspectives that enriched Roman culture and history. As they adjusted to their everyday lives, they contributed new ideas and energy, making a mark on the very society that had once enslaved them. Their legacies were about resilience and the ability to make a difference, even after enduring hardship. As the Roman troops conquered diverse territories, the treatment of POWs evolved with the influences of foreign lands and the outcomes of wars. Captured soldiers from distant regions didn't all face the same grim fate. Sometimes their origins could lead to better treatment, or conversely, more severe punishments. For instance, Greek or Egyptian warriors often caught the Romans' interest due to their foreign nature. They were sometimes treated more as curiosities or political tools than mere captives, valued for what they could offer in terms of knowledge or leverage. Prisoner exchanges were common too. Romans and their adversaries used these swaps strategically, like chess pieces, to tip the scales of diplomacy or cement agreements. These trades were more than just about the individuals involved. They were strategic plays that could influence political alliances. Incorporating practices from the cultures they encountered, the Romans adapted their approach to handling POWs. This resulted in a system that flexed Rome's power, but also played a role in maintaining a delicate balance with neighboring powers, who might be enemies one moment and allies the next. Rome's handling of prisoners tells a tale of power, fear, and sometimes mercy. It makes us question, in today's world, are we repeating history or have we set a new course? How does this reflect on us? This is History Uncharted. See you next time.